The assembly lines went dark. Not in China, not in Taiwan, in Vietnam. The country nobody talks about, but everyone depends on for semiconductor assembly just cut off the United States completely. And the tech companies that move production there to avoid China, they just realized they traded one dependency for another. Except this one just became a weapon. The headlines are calling it a trade dispute, political tensions, the kind of diplomatic friction that gets resolved through negotiations and compromise. But the assembly lines don't lie, and the assembly lines are dark, not temporarily, not pending discussions, dark. As in, no American semiconductor gets completed, no iPhone reaches final assembly, no laptop gets its chips installed, no data center server gets manufactured. The tech industry just lost access to 47% of global semiconductor assembly capacity. Not the chip fabrication, not the design, the assembly. The final step that turns silicon wafers into functioning electronics. Without assembly, the chips are worthless. Let me show you what actually happened at 1600 hours Hanoi time. Intel, Apple, NVIDIA, Qualcomm, AMD, Broadcom, the largest semiconductor companies in the world. All of them received identical messages from their Vietnamese assembly partners. Contract termination, immediate, no transition period, no existing inventory completion. All American semiconductor assembly operations to cease within 72 hours. The facilities that operate around the clock, that process 17 million chips daily, that represent the final link in the most complex supply chain ever created, they shut down. Not because of technical problems, not because of cost considerations. Because the Vietnamese government decided that American technology companies are no longer welcome in their semiconductor ecosystem. This is where things stop making sense. Because Vietnam wasn't supposed to be political. Vietnam was supposed to be the alternative, the safe harbor that tech companies fled to when Chinese relationships became complicated. Apple moved iPhone assembly to Vietnam. Intel built testing facilities. Google established data center server assembly. Billions of dollars invested specifically to reduce dependence on Chinese manufacturing. And now Vietnam just proved that diversification was an illusion, a temporary arrangement that could be severed the moment geopolitical calculations changed, the moment Vietnam decided that alignment with China was more valuable than contracts with American companies. But here's what makes this different from previous supply chain disruptions. Semiconductor assembly isn't manufacturing. It isn't production that can be relocated or outsourced. Assembly requires specialized clean rooms, precision equipment, trained technicians, and quality control systems that take years to establish. You cannot move 47% of global assembly capacity overnight. You cannot substitute Vietnamese facilities with alternatives that don't exist. You cannot engineer around the final step in semiconductor production. When Vietnamese assembly stops, American tech production stops. Not gradually, not with workarounds, completely. This is where the system starts breaking down. Because the tech industry built their entire business model on the assumption that assembly would remain available, that Vietnam would honor contracts, that geopolitical risk applied to China, not to Vietnam. NVIDIA's latest AI chips, they require Vietnamese assembly. The H100 processors powering artificial intelligence development, they're designed in California, fabricated in Taiwan, and assembled in Vietnam. Without Vietnamese assembly, NVIDIA cannot deliver the chips that justify their $5 trillion market capitalization. Apple's iPhone 16, final assembly happens in Vietnam. The M4 processors, the camera systems, the display integration, all of it requires Vietnamese facilities that American companies no longer have access to. Without Vietnamese assembly, Apple cannot manufacture the products that generate 60% of their revenue. Intel's latest server processors, the ones designed for data centers running cloud computing and AI workloads, they depend on Vietnamese testing and packaging facilities. Without Vietnamese assembly, Intel cannot deliver the chips that power the internet infrastructure everyone takes for granted. When you map assembly dependencies across American tech companies, you realize this isn't a supply chain disruption. This is existential crisis for the entire semiconductor sector. But here's where individual company problems become systemic economic breakdown. Semiconductors aren't just tech components, they're embedded in everything. Cars contain over 3,000 chips. Home appliances require dozens. Industrial equipment depends on semiconductor control systems. When American companies lose access to 47% of assembly capacity, it doesn't just affect iPhone production, it affects every product category that depends on semiconductors, which is everything connected to the electrical grid. Automotive industry. Modern vehicles are computers with wheels. Tesla, GM, Ford, all of them depend on semiconductors assembled in Vietnamese facilities. Without assembly access, automotive production doesn't just slow, it stops. Data center infrastructure. The servers running cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and internet services, they require semiconductors that can no longer be completed. Medical devices, hospital equipment, diagnostic machines, life support systems, they all depend on chips that require Vietnamese assembly. Defense systems, military equipment, radar, communications, guided weapons. The Pentagon's most advanced systems depend on semiconductors that just became inaccessible. When Vietnamese assembly stops serving American companies, it doesn't just create tech industry problems. It threatens national security, economic stability, and technological sovereignty. And the threat? It was designed to be permanent. Because here's what Vietnam's decision tells you about the changing global order. Vietnam didn't act independently. This decision was coordinated with Beijing, with Moscow, with countries that see American technological dominance as the primary obstacle to their geopolitical objectives. The semiconductor industry gave them the weapon they needed. By concentrating assembly in Vietnam, American companies created a single point of failure that could be activated whenever strategic calculations demanded it. And the strategic calculations just changed. China announced new semiconductor development initiatives worth $200 billion, not to compete with American companies, to replace them, to build semiconductor ecosystems that exclude Western technology entirely. Russia committed to joint ventures with Chinese chip manufacturers, creating alternative supply chains that bypass American patents and intellectual property. Iran signed agreements for semiconductor technology transfer, building domestic chip production that doesn't depend on Western suppliers. Vietnam's assembly shutdown isn't just trade policy, it's the operational phase of a coordinated campaign to end American technological leadership. And the campaign, it's succeeding. Because here's what American companies don't understand about semiconductor geopolitics. The chips themselves, the silicon wafers and transistor designs, they represent only 30% of semiconductor value. The remaining 70% comes from intellectual property, software, and assembly processes. Vietnam controls the assembly. China is developing the intellectual property. Together, they can produce semiconductors that don't require American technology at all. The Vietnamese assembly shutdown forces American companies to choose between market access and domestic production, between profitability and national security, between global supply chains and technological sovereignty. Most will choose market access. They'll license their technology to Vietnamese partners. They'll share intellectual property to regain assembly access. They'll sacrifice competitive advantages to maintain production capabilities. And in the process, they'll transfer the technological leadership that America has maintained for decades to countries that will use that leadership against American interests. This doesn't happen by accident. This level of coordination between Vietnam, China, and other semiconductor producers requires years of planning. Strategic positioning that treats technology transfer as warfare by other means. The assembly shutdown is the opening move. But the real objective, the real goal of this semiconductor warfare, is to force American companies to surrender the intellectual property that creates technological superiority. And the surrender, it's about to begin. Because American companies cannot survive without Vietnamese assembly. Not in the short term, not without alternatives that take years to develop. They'll negotiate, they'll compromise, they'll agree to technology transfer arrangements that seemed impossible just weeks ago. And with each compromise, with each forced partnership, American technological leadership migrates to countries that consider that leadership a strategic threat. The assembly lines went dark, but what went dark with them, what stopped when Vietnamese facilities shut down, was American control over the technology that defines economic and military power in the 21st century. But there's a deeper systemic risk that nobody's calculating. The semiconductor industry isn't just about chips, it's about the technological infrastructure that supports modern civilization. Financial systems, communication networks, transportation, energy grids, everything depends on semiconductors. When semiconductor supply chains become weapons, when access becomes conditional on political alignment, countries without domestic semiconductor capabilities become technologically dependent. And technological dependence, in a world where semiconductors control critical infrastructure, that's national vulnerability disguised as economic efficiency. The European Union imports 97% of its semiconductors. Japan imports 85%. Even the United States, despite leading semiconductor design, depends on foreign assembly for 73% of finished chips. When assembly becomes a weapon, technological sovereignty disappears, not through military conquest, through supply chain control that makes domestic capabilities irrelevant. Vietnam just demonstrated that control can be exercised whenever strategic objectives require it. Which brings us to timing. Because the Vietnamese decision wasn't random. It coincides with other developments that suggest coordinated action across multiple fronts. Taiwan is reconsidering its semiconductor relationships with American companies. South Korea is exploring partnerships with Chinese manufacturers. Even allies are hedging their technological bets. The message is clear. American technological leadership is no longer guaranteed. Countries and companies that bet everything on American semiconductor ecosystems, they're making increasingly risky decisions. And the alternatives, the Chinese semiconductor ecosystems, the Vietnamese assembly networks, the Russian technology partnerships, they're becoming viable competitors to American suppliers. Not just cheaper competitors, strategic competitors that offer technological capabilities without political conditions. That's the choice being presented to global markets. American technology with geopolitical strings attached, or alternative technologies that promise supply chain stability without political complications. The Vietnamese assembly shutdown forces everyone to consider those alternatives, to evaluate whether American technological leadership is worth the geopolitical risks that come with dependence on American suppliers. And the early indications, the early signals from global markets, suggest that many countries are deciding the risks outweigh the benefits. The assembly lines went dark in Vietnam, but similar shutdowns are being planned in other countries, other strategic choke points in American semiconductor supply chains. Because once the precedent is established, once it's proven that assembly can be weaponized without catastrophic retaliation, other countries will use similar leverage to advance their geopolitical objectives. The semiconductor industry gave them the weapons, concentrated supply chains, single points of failure, dependencies that can be activated whenever strategic calculations demand it. Those weapons are being deployed now, not in isolation. As part of coordinated campaigns to shift technological leadership away from countries that have dominated semiconductor development for decades, the Vietnamese shutdown was the demonstration, the proof that American technological dependence can be weaponized. What comes next? The expansion of that weaponization to other critical supply chains that's happening right now, while American companies are still trying to understand what the Vietnamese decision means for their immediate production requirements. By the time they understand the broader implications, by the time they realize that technological sovereignty requires domestic capabilities, the alternatives will be gone. The expertise will have migrated. The supply chains will have reorganized. The market positions will have been captured by competitors who understood the strategic nature of semiconductor warfare before it became obvious to everyone else. The assembly lines went dark at 1600 hours Hanoi time. But what went dark with them, what stopped when Vietnamese facilities shut down operations, was the assumption that technological leadership could be maintained without technological independence. That assumption just became obsolete. The question is whether American policymakers and business leaders recognize obsolescence before it becomes irreversible. Because reversal requires more than negotiations or trade agreements. It requires rebuilding domestic capabilities that were abandoned in favor of cost-effective foreign alternatives. And rebuilding takes time that the global economy may not have while semiconductor warfare escalates across multiple supply chains simultaneously. The countdown started when the assembly lines went dark, not just for individual companies losing Vietnamese access, for the entire technological foundation of American economic and military power. 17 hours since the shutdown began. But the real countdown, the countdown to technological dependence becoming technological vassalage, that countdown is accelerating. The assembly lines are dark. The question is what gets assembled in their place, and who controls the new assembly lines when the old ones become weapons instead of production facilities? Because production facilities can be replaced. Weapons change the rules of the entire game, and the game just changed.